I think, first of all, we've thought for some time that Russia has been moving nuclear weapons into Belarus, and in fact, even last year, Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, was very happy to tell everybody that he had Russian tactical nuclear weapons. This latest move by the exiled opposition leader, in the context, she's trying to tell Europe to wake up, to see what is happening, see what's happening in her country. She does believe, of course, that she should be the democratic president, democratically elected, and wants the West to do more. Of course, Belarus is a strategic position between Russia, just to the north of Ukraine, and just to the east of Poland and the Baltic states. So it's in a very important position. And it comes at a time when European countries are suggesting that they actually believe that Europe should have its own nuclear deterrent. So it's I suppose, upping the rhetoric, and the fact that the other thing she points out is which is perfectly reasonable, that if Russian nuclear weapons are closer to Europe, they can strike much more quickly. I think one of the challenges the Russian nuclear deterrent has, particularly its ballistic missiles, they have a pretty long time of flight to targets in Europe and the US, and the Western sort of defense mechanisms, anti-missile capability is probably more advanced than the Russians are. So it is an area of concern, certainly, that Europe, by demonstrating that it's looking at its own nuclear weapons, are taking very seriously. I think she certainly has a point. And Europe, including the UK, has vastly overspent the peace dividend at the end of the Cold War. And had we not done that, no doubt Putin wouldn't have invaded Ukraine in the first place and wouldn't have had so much influence over Belarus. But it is clear also that Europe has now heeded those warnings, and at the Munich Security Conference over the last weekend has really demonstrated resolve to increase spending on defence. And the UK Prime Minister today is suggesting that UK is going to spend much more on defence, much more quickly. So I think Europe is finally picking up the cudgel. But the exile leader of exile opposition leader of Belarus, obviously she would much prefer to be there. And Belarus is an autocratic country ruled by Lukashenko, who rules in the same way that Putin does. So one does sympathise with her, but I think Europe has finally woken up to the position, is actually starting to do something about it. Let's hope it's not too late. I think Lukashenko is very much a puppet of the Russian regime, and Lukashenko will do anything that Putin asks him to do. There are concerns that the Russians might try and open up another front, particularly to the north. There's a lot of talk of the Russians potentially trying to link up with Kaliningrad, which is at the back end of Lithuania, if you like, or on the Baltic Sea. And even at the moment, Russia has access to Kaliningrad through Lithuania. And there's a big concern that actually if the Russians did that, then that would be a significant problem for NATO. And a lot of that could be done through Belarus. And it's clear that Lukashenko is happy for the Russians to do whatever they like in Belarus. So, yeah, it is in a key strategic position, right slap bang in the middle of sort of European NATO countries. We need to be very wary of it. I would say, that the idea that these Russian nuclear weapons have been moved to certain sites in Belarus, it would appear that we know exactly where there are. And there's, open source satellite pictures on the internet today showing exactly where they are. So it's a slightly double-edged piece here, I would have thought. Although we probably know where most of Russia's nuclear capability is, to have this so clear, on the one hand, Lukashenko and Putin might think it gives them an advantage, but on the other hand, we know that Western anti-missile defense is much more sophisticated than that Russians have, and one would assume if we know exactly where these missiles are, it would be more straightforward to take them out than if we didn't. Well, we're hearing it's called the Oreshnik, which is a ballistic missile. Actually has a range, I understand, up to about 4,000 to 5,000 kilometers, so quite a long range. We don't know what sort of warheads are going to be on them, but the assumption is that it's some sort of nuclear warhead, whether it's a strategic, in other words, a very, very large one, or what we call a battlefield warhead, is probably neither here nor there. But the fact that they are being moved closer to Europe is aggressive move, and the fact that Europe is taking this so very seriously and suggesting that it will get its own nuclear weapons outside of control from the US, I think is equally as significant. I'm not sure that this is a new message as such. We've known for some time the Russians intend to move tactical nuclear capability to Belarus because it would be much more easy for them to use those weapons against Ukraine and against Eastern European countries. The exiled opposition leader has chosen this moment, no doubt tied in with the security conference in Munich this weekend, to highlight this position. It also comes at a time when others are talking about nuclear capability, particularly Poland and Sweden and France. So, and the fact that the UK has recently purchased F-35As, which are nuclear capable strategic bombers, again, is a suggestion that the UK is considering extending its nuclear capability. So I think whenever anything in the nuclear perspective is talked about, obviously people get very concerned. And the key thing about the deterrent is equilibrium. If in simple terms both sides have roughly the same, then it's, for the last 80 years, it has remained an effective deterrent. When it gets out of equilibrium and somebody might think they have an advantage, then that is where it becomes a challenge. And I think maybe this is what people are concerned about, is that the equilibrium that has kept the peace is in danger of going out of kilter. And that is the area I think of most concern. I think President Macron, the French president, and some of the other countries, including the Germans very significantly, are talking about getting a nuclear capability, probably tactical or battlefield nuclears. What is not in equilibrium at the moment is that Russians have a lot of tactical nuclear weapons. These are the ones they can use on the battlefield to, say, destroy an airfield or a small town. Now, European countries don't have that. France has a few. We gave up our tactical nuclear weapons in the 90s, but we appear to be discussing getting new ones. So I think the European talk about a nuclear capability is very much in the tactical or battlefield side, really to balance things up against the Russians. And I'm sure, if the Russians knew that that if they used their own tactical nukes, they would get the same back, then that would change the dynamic and their thought pattern. So I think that's what European leaders are looking at the moment.